You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
There's a story the world thinks it knows. For boys from Liverpool who changed music forever, who stood together on stage and smiled for the cameras, who wrote songs that would outlive them all. The Beatles. A brotherhood. A legend. But legends have shadows, and inside that shadow live a relationship so complicated, so layered with resentment and wounded pride, that even decades after the band fell apart, the wounds had not fully closed. We talk endlessly about John and Paul, their rivalry, their genius, their push and pull. We analyze every chord, every lyric, every sideways glance in a documentary. But there was a third man in that creative storm, a man who stood slightly to the side, watched everything unfold, and quietly burned. George Harrison, the one they called the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, the patient one. Except George Harrison was not always patient, and he was not always quiet. And the man he carried the deepest, most unresolved feelings toward was not a stranger, not a critic, not a scheming music executive. It was someone who had been in his life since before the fame, since before the records, since before the world knew any of their names. The full truth of that relationship, the years of dismissal, the creative wounds, the emotional distance, and the silence that George Harrison chose when words would have been too revealing, is a story that deserves to be told properly. So let us tell it. To understand why George Harrison felt what he felt, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the Beatles. Further back than that. George Harold Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a modest terraced house at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool. He was the youngest of 4 children, born to Harold Harrison, a bus conductor who had once worked as a ship's steward, and Louise Harrison, a woman of Irish Catholic descent who worked as a shop assistant. The house was simple, even by the standards of post-war Liverpool. There was no indoor toilet. He came from a single coal fire. Space was tight, and money was tighter. But Louise Harrison was remarkable. She had a singing voice that reportedly rattled the windows, and she carried a deep and genuine love of music that she passed directly to her youngest child. According to Harrison biographer Joshua Green, Louise would listen to Radio India broadcasts during her pregnancy with George, drawn to the exotic and meditative sounds of sitars and tablas. Whether or not those prenatal soundscapes shaped George's later devotion to Indian music, the image tells you everything about the household he came from. Music was not background noise in the Harrison home. It was a living, breathing thing. George absorbed it all. Early on, he was drawn to artists like Django Reinhardt, Carl Perkins, Cab Calloway, and Lonnie Donegan. But the moment that cracked everything open came in early 1956, when a 13-year-old George was riding his bicycle through the streets of Liverpool and heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifting from a nearby house. He nearly fell off his bike. From that moment, rock and roll was all he cared about. His mother bought him his first guitar for £3 and 10 shillings. He formed a skiffle group with his brother Peter called the Rebels. He practiced obsessively. He drew guitars in his school books. He told anyone who would listen that he was going to play music for the rest of his life. And then he met Paul McCartney on a school bus. This is where the story gets complicated, because the relationship that would eventually define so much of George Harrison's frustration did not begin in bitterness. It began in admiration. Paul McCartney was a year and a half older than George, which is a significant gap when you are a teenager. But they bonded immediately over their shared obsession with music, learning guitar chords together, trading tips, sitting side by side, and figuring out the language of rock and roll. McCartney has spoken warmly about those early years, calling Harrison his little brother, his baby brother, someone he loved from the very first meeting. Paul was the one who introduced George to John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, in early 1958. John was skeptical. The boy was 15 barely, and Lennon at 17 thought that was too young. But George auditioned on a Liverpool bus, playing the lead guitar instrumental raunchy note for note, and Lennon was impressed enough to let him in. So from the very beginning, George Harrison entered John Lennon's world through Paul McCartney's door. That dynamic, George as the younger one, the one who needed vouching for, the one who had to prove himself, would echo through everything that followed. For a while it did not matter. The band evolved, moved through names and lineups, eventually became the Beatles, and headed to Hamburg, where they played grueling multi-hour sets in smoky clubs and hammered themselves into one of the tightest live acts in the world. George was deported from Hamburg at one point for being underage, which tells you something about how young he still was when all of this was happening. He He was barely 17, playing adult venues in a foreign country, holding his own alongside older, more experienced musicians. By the time Brian Epstein came along in late 1961 and the Beatles signed with EMI, George Harrison was a full and essential member of the band. He was the lead guitarist. He was the one who listened most carefully to American music and brought those influences back to the group. He was the scout, the ear, the quiet technician who understood tone and feel in ways that the others sometimes did not. But he was also, from very early on, the third songwriter. The one whose songs came after Lennon's. After McCartney's. Always after. Let us be honest about what it meant to be in the Beatles and not be Lennon or McCartney. Those two were extraordinary. Their songwriting partnership produced some of the most enduring music in human history. They had a chemistry that was almost supernatural, a push and pull between John's raw edges and Paul's melodic instinct that generated hit after hit after hit. When you are standing next to that, even if you are brilliant, even if you are growing every single day, there is a ceiling on how much room exists for you. George Harrison felt that ceiling pressing down on him for years. On the Beatles' first album, he had 2 lead vocal credits. By the second album, he had 3, including Don't Bother Me, his first songwriting credit for the band. That was 1963. By the time of Rubber Soul in 1965, Harrison was writing songs that showed genuine sophistication and originality. By Revolver in 1966, he opened the entire album with Taxman, one of the sharpest political songs in the band's catalog, and also contributed Love You Too, which brought Indian classical music into the mainstream Western ear in a way that had never been done before. He was not a third-rate songwriter. He was not a passenger. He was one of the most innovative musical minds of his generation, a man who would single-handedly broaden the sonic palette of popular music by immersing himself in Indian classical traditions, studying under Ravi Shankar, and bringing those textures back to the recording studio. And yet, album after album, he was allowed 2 songs. Maybe 3. While Lennon and McCartney filled the rest of the space between them, George sat on a backlog of compositions that were going unheard, unreleased, gathering dust while the world waited for the next Lennon-McCartney creation. The frustration this created was not petty jealousy. It was the frustration of an artist who knew his own worth and watched it being systematically undervalued by the people closest to him. Now we reach the heart of the matter. Because while George Harrison's tensions with Paul McCartney are well documented and often discussed, the deeper and more psychologically complex relationship was the one with John Lennon. George looked up to John. That is the foundation of everything. When he auditioned for the Quarrymen, it was John Lennon's approval he was seeking. John was the leader. John was the sharpest wit in any room, the most intellectually restless, the most dangerous creative mind George had ever encountered. For a young man from Wavertree who had grown up in a council house and taught himself guitar from borrowed tips, John Lennon represented everything that rock and roll could be. And John Lennon, for a time, gave George a place to stand. But John Lennon also had a cruel streak. He was brilliant and funny and searingly honest, but that honesty could curdle into dismissiveness, and that dismissiveness was something George Harrison experienced more than anyone outside the band ever knew. As the Beatles rose to fame and their musical ambitions grew, George began to develop his own distinct artistic identity. His exploration of Indian music and Eastern philosophy was not a passing phase or a trendy affectation. It was a genuine spiritual and musical awakening. He studied seriously. He traveled to India. He sat at the feet of Ravi Shankar and learned. He brought back not just musical techniques, but a whole philosophical framework that would inform everything he created for the rest of his life. John Lennon was skeptical of this. At times he was outright mocking. Lennon had his own spiritual wanderings, of course. He was genuinely interested in transcendence, in pushing beyond the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. But his relationship to George's specific path, to the devotional practice, the Hare Krishna movement, the deep immersion in Hindu philosophy, was often characterized by a kind of impatient condescension. He would poke fun at it. He would undercut it. He would treat something that was sacred to George as material for a joke. For a man whose spiritual life was not decoration but foundation, this was a wound that went very deep. Beyond the spiritual mockery, there was the creative dismissal that George experienced from John throughout their years together. George would bring songs to the band and watch as they received cursory attention, minimal enthusiasm, and were shuffled to the back of the album. This happened repeatedly. The process was rarely explicitly cruel. It did not need to be. What it needed to be was consistent, and it was. George's songs were treated as filler, as B material, as the stuff you put on while the real songs were being prepared. And John was the gatekeeper of that attitude, as much as Paul was. When Paul was being domineering and controlling in the studio, insisting on elaborate arrangements and spending endless hours on a song that George found frivolous, John rarely intervened on George's behalf. When George's spiritual songs were met with rolled eyes or lukewarm responses, John was often leading the chorus of indifference. There is a telling moment that illuminates this dynamic. During the White Album sessions in 1968, George brought in Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, one of the most emotionally resonant songs in the entire Beatles catalog. He brought in an outside musician, his close friend, specifically because he felt that his bandmates would behave better, would take the song more seriously if a respected outside presence was in the room. That is a remarkable thing to admit, that you do not trust your own band to take your work seriously. And by early 1969, during the brutal filming of what would become the Let It Be documentary, George Harrison had reached a breaking point. January 1969. The Beatles gathered at Twickenham Film Studios to rehearse and record with cameras rolling for a documentary. The footage, captured raw and unedited, showed a band in the process of falling apart in real time. And the most searing footage was of George Harrison and Paul McCartney. There is a scene, preserved for history, in which McCartney instructs Harrison on how to play a guitar part. The condescension is palpable. McCartney talks to Harrison the way a music teacher might talk to an uncertain student, not as a peer, not as one of the most gifted guitarists of his generation, but as someone who needs to be guided and corrected. Harrison's response is quiet and controlled, but there is something underneath it that is unmistakable. He says with extraordinary patience, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." That sentence, delivered calmly, is one of the most devastating things ever caught on a Beatles recording. Because it is not submission, is withdrawal, is a man telling you that he is done trying to be seen. Shortly after that exchange, George Harrison walked out of the sessions. He quit the Beatles. He told his bandmates he was leaving, and he left. He came back 12 days later, after the band agreed to move to Apple Studio and abandoned Paul's plan for a live concert return. But the fact that he walked out all, that it reached that point, tells you everything about the cumulative weight of what had been building for years. And while McCartney was the immediate trigger, the kindling that had been laid over years included John Lennon's consistent minimization of George's contributions and his spiritual path. In 1980, George Harrison published his autobiography. He called it I Me Mine. It was a deeply personal document, full of reflections on his music, his spirituality, his life. And one of the most discussed aspects of the book was not something it contained, but something it almost entirely omitted. John Lennon. For a man who had shared a stage, a studio, a decade of his life, and the most extraordinary musical journey in the history of popular music with John Lennon, Harrison gave him almost no space in the book. The mentions are sparse, glancing, peripheral. Lennon is present mostly by absence, which in a way says more than any explicit accusation could. When Lennon heard about this, he was furious. He gave an interview in late 1980, shortly before his death, in which he complained bitterly about the omission. He felt overlooked, dismissed, written out. He felt that George had failed to acknowledge the foundational role John had played in his life and career. The irony was so sharp it could cut. For years, George Harrison had felt overlooked, dismissed, and written out by John Lennon. And now Lennon was experiencing exactly that feeling coming in the other direction. John Lennon was killed on December 8, 1980. He died before he and George ever had the chance to fully resolve what existed between them. That unresolved state, that conversation that never happened, is perhaps the most haunting element of the entire story. George mourned. Of course he did. But he also did not pretend, in the years that followed, that their relationship had been simple or uncomplicated or free of pain. He said in interviews that John could be difficult, that John could be selfish, that their relationship had real darkness in it, not just the brightness that the mythology preferred to remember. Before we move to the aftermath, we should acknowledge what George Harrison achieved in the final chapter of the Beatles. Abbey Road, recorded in the summer of 1969, was in many ways George Harrison's moment of arrival. He contributed 2 songs that stand among the greatest in the Beatles' entire body of work. Something, and Here Comes the Sun. Both were written during a period when Harrison was finding his own ground, asserting his creative identity, refusing any longer to accept the role of the junior partner. Something became the first Harrison-penned A-side single in Beatles history, and it performed accordingly. It reached #1 across multiple countries and spent decades being cited as one of the greatest love songs ever written. Frank Sinatra performed it repeatedly and called it the finest love song of the past 50 years. John Lennon said it was the best track on Abbey Road. Think about that for a moment. John Lennon, who had spent years treating George's compositions as secondary material, acknowledged that George Harrison had written the best song on their final album.